Below the wooden decks of transatlantic slave ships lay a world deliberately hidden from sight. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into narrow, airless spaces, chained side by side, with barely enough room to sit, much less stand or move. These ships were not designed for human dignity or safety. They were engineered for profit. Every inch of space was calculated. Every body counted not as a person, but as, for weeks or even months at sea, darkness surrounded them, the ceiling pressed low above their heads, the floors slick with moisture, and the air thick with heat and the smell of suffering. Many had been torn from their families only days before. Now they found themselves bound to strangers, unable to speak the same language, united only by fear and uncertainty. In this confined world, time lost meaning. Days blended into nights as the ship rolled endlessly across the ocean. The purpose of this overcrowding was simple and cruel. The more people forced aboard, the greater the profit waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. Ship records and eyewitness accounts reveal that captains knowingly accepted high death rates as a cost of doing business. Human lives were reduced to numbers in ledgers, losses balanced against potential gains. Survival itself became an act of endurance. This story is not just about ships or trade routes. It is about human beings pushed to the limits of physical and emotional survival, and about a system that valued money over life. Understanding these conditions helps us confront the realities of the past and recognize how deeply this history shaped the modern world. If you find this story important and believe these voices deserve to be remembered, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures they are never forgotten. Below the crowded decks described earlier, the air itself became another form of suffering. Once the hatches were closed, fresh air and daylight disappeared, sealing hundreds of people inside a floating space that felt less like a ship and more like a living prison. The same wooden walls that had been built to protect the vessel from the ocean now trapped heat, moisture, and breath, turning the hold into a suffocating chamber where every inhale carried the weight of countless others. As the days passed, the conditions worsened. With no proper sanitation, bodily waste collected where people lay chained together, unable to move away or clean themselves. Seasickness added to the misery, and vomit mixed with sweat on the planks beneath their bodies. The ship rolled constantly, spreading filth across the floor, soaking clothing and skin, and making rest nearly impossible. The smell was overwhelming, a heavy presence that clung to the air and refused to fade, even when the hatches were briefly opened. Heat intensified everything. Near the equator, the hold became unbearably hot, especially when dozens of bodies were pressed tightly together. Moisture from sweat and seawater soaked into the wood, creating a damp environment where breathing felt like swallowing air through cloth. For many, each breath burned the lungs, and dizziness and weakness followed. Those already weakened by capture and confinement struggled the most, their bodies slowly giving in to exhaustion and illness. Darkness deepened the terror. With little or no light, people could not see the faces of those beside them, only hear labored breathing, coughing, and whispered prayers. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the absence of sunlight, measured only by the creaking of the ship and the rhythm of waves striking the hull. In this darkness, fear grew stronger, fed by uncertainty and the constant presence of suffering all around. These conditions were not accidental. They were the direct result of choices made to prioritize space efficiency and profit over human well-being. Ship designs allowed for minimal ventilation, and captains often kept the holds sealed to prevent resistance, even when it meant worsening the air below. Contemporary accounts from sailors, as in later abolitionist investigations, describe the hold as so full that even crew members struggled to endure it for long. Yet those trapped inside had no escape. Linked to the overcrowding already described, the toxic air and filth transformed confinement into a daily struggle for survival. The environment itself became an invisible force, wearing down bodies and minds alike. Illness spread quickly in these conditions. But even those who avoided disease faced relentless physical stress. Survival depended not only on strength, but on the ability to endure an atmosphere designed to strip away comfort, dignity, and hope. In this sealed world beneath the deck, suffering was constant and inescapable. The lack of air and light did more than harm the body. It reinforced the message that those inside were meant to be unseen and unheard. Yet even in this darkness, the will to endure persisted, quietly challenging a system that tried to reduce human lives to silence and shadow. As the air below deck grew heavier and the filth seeped into every plank of wood, sickness followed with terrifying speed. Disease did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, carried by weakened bodies, contaminated water, and the unrelenting conditions already described. What began as coughing, fever, or stomach pain often became something far more serious within days. In the confined space of the ship's hold, illness had nowhere to go, and neither did the people trapped beside it. Smallpox spread through contact and shared air, its symptoms appearing one after another among those chained together. Fevers rose, skin burned, and strength drained away while darkness and heat made relief impossible. Dysentery, fueled by polluted water and the absence of sanitation, left many too weak to sit upright, let alone endure the long days at sea. Scurvy, caused by severe nutritional deficiency, slowly robbed bodies of resilience, turning minor wounds into serious threats and making recovery unlikely. Each illness fed into the next, creating a cycle of decline that the environment itself encouraged. The ship's hold became a place where survival depended on chance as much as endurance. Those already injured or malnourished from capture were often the first to fall ill. But even the strongest could not escape the constant exposure. With people lying shoulder to shoulder, sickness moved faster than any attempt to contain it. When one person weakened, others soon followed, not because of individual failure, but because the conditions made resistance nearly impossible. Historical records kept by ship captains reveal a chilling reality. Deaths were carefully counted, noted in logs alongside weather conditions and cargo totals. Many voyagers accepted that a portion of the people on board would not survive the crossing. Estimates drawn from these records suggest that between 10 and 20% of captives died during the Middle Passage, though some journeys claimed even more lives. These numbers were not hidden. They were calculated risks, weighed against expected profits at the journey's end. For those still alive, witnessing sickness and loss became part of daily existence. In the dim light below deck, people listened as breathing grew shallow. Voices faded, and movement slowed. The sounds of suffering blended with the creaking of the ship, making it difficult to tell where the vessel ended and human pain began. The emotional toll was immense, as each loss reinforced the uncertainty of survival and the sense that the ocean itself had become a barrier between life and hope. The spread of disease also shaped how time was experienced. Days passed marked not by sunlight, but by who was still breathing nearby. Each morning brought fear that someone else would not rise again. Even brief moments on deck, when allowed, offered little relief, as weakened bodies struggled to recover from nights spent in poisoned air. Illness followed people wherever they were moved, a reminder that the damage had already been done below. This chapter of the journey cannot be separated from the overcrowding, darkness, and lack of air that came before it. Disease thrived because the environment allowed it to thrive. The ship itself became a vessel not only for forced migration, but for widespread suffering that left lasting scars on survivors. Understanding these realities reveals how death during the Middle Passage was not an accident of nature, but the foreseeable result of choices made again and again, voyage after voyage, at the expense of human life. Hunger became another constant presence below deck, joining the foul air, spreading illness, and unending confinement already shaping daily existence. Food was distributed not as nourishment, but as a calculation. Rations were kept small, often made up of unfamiliar grains or thin broths, chosen for their low cost and long shelf life rather than their ability to sustain strength. Water, equally limited, was rationed carefully, even as heat and sickness drained bodies faster than supplies could replace them. For many, the first days at sea brought confusion as much as hunger. The food offered was unlike anything they had known before, difficult to swallow when fear and grief had already tightened their throats. As time passed, weakness set. Legs trembled. Vision blurred, and simple movements required effort. In the crowded hold, where illness was already spreading, lack of proper nourishment made bodies more vulnerable, turning minor discomforts into serious threats. Dehydration intensified the suffering. With so many people confined together, fresh water was guarded closely, and access depended on the ship's schedule rather than human need. Those weakened by fever or stomach illness lost fluids quickly, yet could not drink enough to recover. Dry mouths and cracked lips became common, and the effort to breathe thick, overheated air only increased thirst. Hunger and dehydration worked together, slowly wearing down physical resistance. Refusing food was one of the few ways some captives attempted to assert control over their situation. For individuals who had already lost their freedom, rejecting rations became a quiet form of protest or an expression of despair. However, this resistance was often met with harsh responses. Crew members, determined to protect their financial investment, forced food into mouths that no longer had the strength or will to accept it. These moments added another layer of trauma, transforming even eating into a source of fear and humiliation. As days turned into weeks, starvation reshaped the atmosphere below deck. Conversations grew quieter, movements slower. People who had once tried to comfort one another now struggled to sit upright. Hunger dulled the senses, but it also sharpened awareness of suffering nearby. The sound of someone coughing or shifting in pain became more alarming when it was clear that there was little strength left to recover. Each meal, sparse it was, became a moment of uncertainty rather than relief. Historical accounts from sailors and later observers confirm that this scarcity was intentional. Providing just enough food to keep people alive for sail was seen as sufficient. Illness, weakness, and even death were accepted risks within this system, already reinforced by overcrowding and disease. Nutrition was not considered in terms of human health, but in terms of cost efficiency and survival rates that could still produce profit at the journey's end. This struggle for sustenance cannot be separated from the conditions already described. Hunger worsened the effects of poor air, filth, and disease, creating a cycle that was difficult to escape. A weakened body could not fight infection, and sickness further reduced appetite and strength. In this way, deprivation became both a cause and a consequence of suffering, tightening its grip with each passing day at sea. Yet even in this state, endurance persisted. Some shared what little they had, offering a sip of water or a portion of food to someone weaker beside them. These small acts, carried out in silence and darkness, reflected a determination to preserve humanity despite a system designed to erase it. Hunger may have shaped their bodies, but it could not fully extinguish the bonds formed in survival, nor the quiet resistance expressed through compassion in the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. Even amid the oppressive heat, stifling air, hunger, and sickness, another layer of fear pressed down on those below-deck violence. Discipline on these ships was brutal and deliberate, meant not only to maintain control over hundreds of people, but to enforce the constant reminder that resistance would meet immediate and severe consequences. Whippings left backs raw and bleeding, each lash a message that defiance, even in its smallest form, could not be tolerated. Iron restraints clamped around wrists and ankles, restricting movement so tightly that even shifting position became painful, and leaving marks that would last long after the journey ended. Branding, in some instances, permanently marked the body. A cruel claim of ownership that reduced individuals to property in the eyes of those who profited from their suffering. The physical pain was only part of the terror. Every act of violence was witnessed by others. The sound of leather against flesh echoing in the wooden hold, mingling with coughing, moaning, and the creak of the ship as it rolled on the waves. Fear traveled faster than the disease already spreading among them, and the anticipation of punishment created a tense, unbroken silence where whispered words could cost lives. Even those who remained physically untouched lived with the knowledge that any misstep, any refusal to eat, any sign of despair could provoke the same brutal response. Crew members used violence strategically, knowing it reinforced obedience and quelled the potential for revolt. Men who showed strength or courage were often targeted first, shackled or beaten to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Women, already vulnerable due to the harsh environment and overcrowding, faced threats of physical assault in addition to abuse of other kinds, further embedding the message that the hold was not a space for autonomy or safety. The combination of overcrowding, disease, and scarcity meant that individuals could neither flee nor recover quickly from injuries, and each wound left both visible and invisible scars. The psychological weight of this brutality intertwined with the physical hardships already endured. Those who survived whippings or beatings carried the memory of pain into every interaction, every meal, and every attempt at rest. Bodies weakened by malnutrition and sickness were more vulnerable to injury, and injuries that might have been minor in another context became life-threatening. Resistance became a risk calculated not only in terms of immediate punishment but in the awareness that survival itself required careful negotiation of every move and word. Historical testimonies and ship logs reveal that this pattern of enforced submission was standard across the Middle Passage. Captains and crew saw violence not as a moral question but as a practical tool for controlling a cargo they valued in monetary terms more than human life. Punishment, pain, and the threat of more were woven into every aspect of life below deck, a grim extension of the system of oppression that had brought people aboard in the first place. Yet, despite the pain and fear, small acts of defiance endured. Some refused to eat or attempted subtle sabotage, while others whispered songs, prayers, or memories of home, preserving fragments of identity beneath the weight of chains and lashes. Violence shaped every moment, leaving its imprint on bodies and minds. But it could not completely extinguish the resilience and courage of those trapped in the hold. Even amid unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit found ways to persist, resist, and endure, silently challenging the system designed to strip away life, hope, and dignity beneath the suffocating decks. Where disease, starvation, and violence already shaped every moment, another form of suffering took hold, one that could not be seen but weighed as heavily as chains or lash marks. The psychological torment of the Middle Passage pressed relentlessly on those trapped below, beginning with the wrenching separation from family and community. People who had once lived with the comfort of familiar voices, shared stories, and the presence of loved ones now found themselves isolated among strangers, their hands shackled to bodies they did not know, their eyes unable to meet those of anyone who might understand their grief. The loss of connection amplified every other hardship, turning each wave against the ship into a reminder of distance from home, safety, and identity. Fear became a constant companion, a shadow that grew longer with every passing day. The threat of punishment, the creak of planks under shifting weight, the whispers of illness and impending death, it all combined into an almost tangible pressure, compressing hope into something nearly invisible. For many, the uncertainty of survival was as terrifying as the physical pain, as they witnessed friends, family, and fellow captives succumb to disease or injury. Each death was a reminder that no one aboard could claim certainty about their own fate, and that life hung by the narrowest thread. Gendered abuse layered additional terror, particularly for women and girls. Sexual violence by crew members was an ever-present danger, turning every interaction into a potential threat and leaving invisible scars that would persist far beyond the voyage. Though subjected to different forms of brutality, were similarly haunted by the vulnerability imposed by chains and the inability to defend themselves. The mental burden of knowing one's body and dignity were constantly at risk intensified the feelings of helplessness and despair. The darkness below deck mirrored the mental shadows growing in the minds of those held captive. With limited light, limited space, and no privacy, moments of reflection often turned toward grief and fear. Some turned inward, withdrawing from the world as a means of survival, while others, unable to cope with the relentless pressure, attempted to escape the unbearable reality through desperate acts. Suicide or self-harm, tragic as they were, emerged as a response to circumstances designed to strip away autonomy, identity, and hope. Yet even amid this psychological torment, signs of resilience persisted. Whispers of memories, shared stories, or quiet songs allowed people to retain fragments of their humanity. The mental endurance required to survive alongside physical suffering, disease, and violence became an act of resistance in itself, a refusal to let the system fully erase individuality and spirit. Each small act of remembrance, of connection, or of silent defiance carved space for hope where hope seemed impossible. Understanding this mental dimension of the Middle Passage links all the hardships described before: overcrowding, filth, illness, hunger, and violence into a single, continuous story of human endurance. The horrors of the voyage were not only carried in wounds, chains, or weakened bodies, but also in the minds of those who bore witness to suffering and loss. Psychological trauma became intertwined with physical survival, leaving legacies that would endure long after the ship reached distant shores. In every heartbeat, in every whispered prayer, and in every quiet act of memory, the human spirit sought to withstand what seemed designed to break it entirely. Within the stifling, dark hold, where every breath was heavy with heat, disease, and the stench of filth, the oppressive reality of gendered violence added another layer of terror to the Middle Passage. Women and girls, already confined in impossible proximity to strangers and facing the relentless weight of starvation, sickness, and punishment, were subjected to a constant threat that their bodies could be violated at any moment. Sexual abuse by crew members was not a hidden risk, it was a persistent danger that hung over every movement, every interaction, a reminder that survival required vigilance beyond avoiding disease or rationing scarce food. The fear of assault infiltrated sleep and thoughts, making even moments of rest tense, and robbing victims of any sense of safety or control. Though not targeted in the same way, faced a different but equally severe form of oppression. Recognized by the crew as the most likely to resist or attempt revolt, they were often bound with tighter chains, their movements restricted more severely than anyone else's. Shackles cut into skin already weakened by hunger and disease, and each forced position became a daily struggle against pain and exhaustion. The physical restraints, while intended to prevent rebellion, also served to reinforce the psychological domination of the ship's officers, turning men into bodies controlled as meticulously as cargo, while their minds remained alert to every threat and calculation of survival. The combined effect of these gendered strategies created an environment where every captive lived under constant vigilance and fear. Women, besides enduring the same suffocating heat, filth, and disease as all aboard, had to navigate the invisible threat of assault, which could strike unpredictably and leave scars invisible to others but profound in their impact. Aware of their heightened vulnerability to restraint and punishment, moved with caution, knowing that a single act perceived as defiance could provoke severe beating or confinement. In this way, the very design of the ship, its routines, and its system of control was shaped to exploit vulnerabilities specific to gender, reinforcing submission through both physical and psychological mechanisms. Despite these horrors, subtle forms of resistance emerged. Women found ways to support each other, sharing what little comfort or reassurance could be offered in whispers or gestures, creating bonds that helped maintain fragments of dignity and human connection. 2. Found small acts of defiance, whether in coordinated silence, careful observation, or moments of shared understanding, asserting their presence and will even in the most restrictive circumstances. These acts, though often invisible to the crew, were critical to maintaining identity and morale, a quiet assertion that human beings, even in the darkest conditions, could preserve a sense of self. The reality of gendered abuse cannot be separated from the broader horrors already endured: the overcrowding, disease, starvation, and violence. Each element compounded the other, creating a landscape where the mind and body were constantly under siege, and where the strategies of captors exploited every vulnerability to maintain control. By understanding the specific ways in which women and men were targeted, we see the deliberate, systematic nature of oppression aboard these vessels, and the extraordinary resilience required simply to survive in these confined, perilous spaces. Humanity was continually tested, yet persistence, solidarity, and subtle resistance offered glimmers of defiance against a system built to erase both identity and hope. Even amid the unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage, human resilience persisted in ways that defied the cruel intentions of those who orchestrated this trade. Captives, bound by chains, weakened by disease, and pressed into suffocating holds, still found ways to assert their humanity. Hunger strikes became an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to comply with the system that sought to treat them as mere cargo, and a statement that their will could not be fully broken. Sabotage of equipment, subtle disruption of routines, and attempts to slow the work of the ship revealed courage and intelligence in the face of constant surveillance and threat. In some cases, revolts emerged, driven by desperation and determination, daring to challenge the overwhelming power of the crew despite near certain consequences. Cultural survival played an equally vital role. In the darkness below deck, stories, songs, and prayers became lifelines to memory, identity, and community. Even when torn from their homelands and scattered among strangers, captives preserved fragments of language, belief, and tradition, ensuring that their humanity was not entirely erased by chains and cruelty. These acts of remembrance and expression provided comfort, solidarity, and resistance, sustaining spirits that physical suffering alone could not extinguish. The Middle Passage was designed to strip life, dignity, and hope from those aboard. Yet the persistent resilience of captives proves that oppression could never fully succeed. Survival was not merely the act of enduring until landfall. It was the daily struggle to maintain identity, to protect one's sense of self, and to preserve the memory of home, family, and culture. Each whispered song, each small act of defiance, and each silent protest carried a message that, even in the darkest hours, humanity could not be completely subdued. Reflecting on these stories allows us to confront the depth of suffering endured during this period and to recognize the extraordinary courage of those who survived. Their resistance, whether subtle or overt, offers lessons about endurance, dignity, and the strength of the human spirit under extreme adversity. While the Middle Passage remains one of history's darkest chapters, the courage and resilience of captives remind us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, hope and defiance can endure. Thank you for joining me to explore this history and to remember the voices that history tried to silence. If this story moved you and you want to continue learning about these important events, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your engagement helps keep these narratives alive and honors the resilience of those who endured the unimaginable.